Hello everyone, welcome to my review of a brand new Japanese indie shmup made by a brand new Japanese developer, Grand Cross Renovation. And I have to say, as cool of a game as this is, the title does strike me as a little bit funny. It definitely reminds me of one of those home decorating shows you'll see when you go to doctor's offices. So they were probably going for something like Grand Cross Revolution or Grand Cross Revelation. And when they were looking in the dictionary, they saw the sort of on-paper word of renovation. It's like, oh, to make anew, to do things over. It's like, oh, that sounds about right. But I don't think they realize there's like this home decor association for a lot of American people. Maybe that's just me, but every time I see the title, I think of like a home decor show. But it can just join the other great shmups with kind of silly titles like Ketsui Destiny or Crisis Wing, where Crisis Wing's a cool name, but it always reminds me of a hospital sim game or something. So Grand Cross Renovation, what's really cool about it is being a Japanese indie shmup made by some Japanese person, probably in his apartment or whatever, is that I had no idea it was coming. I had no expectations for what this would be. For all I know, this did not exist in the universe, and that is something that's really cool about shmups and really cool about smaller indie games and things like that. It's because for the most part, when it comes to most mainstream games, they hype them up, you get trailers, you wait a year and a half, you speculate, all that sort of thing. Even with something like Soul Cresta, the Platinum shmup, we've heard about this for what, almost 2 years now. So people always have things on their radar. But what's cool about the indie space is that something really, truly awesome and amazing can just appear there out of nowhere, no fanfare, and it's kind of up to you to discover it and to spread the word. And that's definitely the case here with Grand Cross Renovation. So let's begin by talking about my very first impression of the game before I even played it, just looking at screenshots, because I had people sending me screenshots of the game and like a little trailer and everything. And at first I wasn't sure what to think, because looking at the screenshots, there were definitely some things about the game that stood out immediately. The first one being is that it is a 16:9 vertical. So a vertical is basically you have the horizontal aspect ratio, especially full 16:9, but it's scrolling vertically. So think of Ikaruga, for example, but it's like spaced out, or Radiant Silvergun. Treasure makes a lot of verticals, but in the 16:9 aspect ratio, and I talked about this in the last video, that's a whole new ball of wax because you have so much more game space, and now you're going upwards. It's just a real challenging aspect ratio. So I was very curious to see how this game would handle that, and I was pretty impressed. So that was the first thing that stood out to me. The second thing that stood out to me are the visuals, and I was very impressed looking at the screenshots of the visuals. I love the style, I love the aesthetic, and so the question was, does this hold up? You know, sometimes when you see games in screenshots, they look awesome, and then when you see them in person, you know, they don't quite hold up. So I was really curious to see how that would go, and just the overall gameplay and mechanics, because it was pretty unique looking from what I was seeing. So let me begin by first of all explaining how this game works and the feel of it and the things that really stood out to me. So the first thing that I was evaluating, like I mentioned, is the aspect ratio and how the game handles that. Because a real challenge of this big, wide aspect ratio is you're either going to run into this problem where you're just filling the screen with all these tiny little dots and it doesn't feel very visceral or exciting. It feels kind of boring, static, bland. You'll see some 16:9 shmup having this problem. And then on the other hand, another thing you need to worry about is how are they going to manage the enemy placements? How are they going to manage the enemies moving around all that screen? Because you've got a lot of real estate to work with, and especially if you're vertical, they're just sitting right on top of you and you can just go left to right, and that actually is a big challenge for a lot of shmups, because let's say you did this with something like Dodonpachi, you wouldn't really have a way to interact with a lot of the things on the screen because you just have the bullets shooting directly in front of you. So you need to come up with some sort of mechanic to address this, and Grand Cross Renovation does. And so the central mechanic of the game, at least of the initial ship, is this beam. And what's really cool is that you can manually aim the beam either by panning it left or panning it right and firing it. And in the sort of advertisement for the game, it says one of the most powerful weapons and shmups of all time. Definitely lives up as to advertised, because this thing is an absolute beast. And the whole game basically revolves around this beam mechanic. And the controls of the game are actually pretty damn sophisticated / complicated. Reminds me a lot of Radiant Silvergun, and I have to think it was directly inspired by Radiant Silvergun's weapon system in a lot of ways. So you have your main beam, then you have a shot, and then you have this sort of alternate shot that you hold with the beam. That's called the scatter. That's basically like the spread weapon, like you'd get in a Radiant Silvergun. And then you have another special weapon, and then you have to manually pan the beam around. So you're working with a lot of buttons, just like Radiant Silvergun. And I will give you a bit of a tip. The first thing you're going to run into, problem-wise, with this game is controlling this damn ship, because it's much more technical than a lot of other shmups. A lot of other shmups are just 1 or 2 buttons. This thing's got at least 6 buttons going on. And so I found a nice solution, which is I went ahead and put a toggle auto fire. I used auto hotkey. I put a toggle auto fire on the shot button. And then so my ship is just always shooting the main shot, and that freed up one of my fingers so that now I can concentrate more on aiming and firing. The thing is if you have the shot firing and then you hold the laser button, then you get like the super laser. So for the most part, I just use the super laser. But if you need to use the normal powered laser, you just turn off the toggle. That was a nice workaround that I found, or you can just be awesome and manage all the buttons and not have the toggle. But if you're having trouble with the controls, that would be my first bit of advice. So that is how the game controls, and that is how the game addresses this aspect ratio, allowing you to cover all areas of the screen with your fire, because you can manually rotate it around you, much like rolling gunner. So this is becoming a theme in modern shmups to deal with this aspect ratio that's so wide. Is okay, let's just give you a gun that spins around and hits everything. So that's how it deals with that. Then the second question is, how does it deal with the enemy placements? Because that is another point of concern, where you could get just a real scattery, ugly, gross enemy layout. And I think, again, this game definitely addresses that very well. And the way it does it is the way that I've actually mentioned possibly looking into fixing this, which is making the enemies huge, making things more magnified, because it gives the game a real visceral feel, and you've got the space for it, might as well use it. So imagine if you were playing like a really bad fighting game. I think there's some bad fighting games you can come across this, where they have, you know, the huge playfield, but the characters are just these tiny little sticks, you know, and then as they move, there's just no real visceralness. Where if you look at most modern fighting games, they have a camera system where as your characters get closer together, it actually zooms in on them. And then when your characters get further apart, it zooms out on them. It gives that nice visceral feel. I think now that we're entering this 16:9 world with these shmups, stuff like this is going to need to be experimented with. Camera systems, zooms in, zooms out. And guess what? Grand Cross Renovation is one of the first shmups I've seen doing this. And presentation-wise, this really impressed me. So there are sections of the game where it will literally zoom out and you get all these enemies. And then there's other sections of the game where it'll pull the camera in nice and tight. I think that's brilliant. I think more shmups need to start doing stuff like this. So that was a big thumbs up for me right there. Great job on the presentation. Great job on managing the aspect ratio. That was something I was very nervous about. Now I think this is an example I can point to when people ask, oh, what should you do with the camera system? What should you do with this giant aspect ratio? I said, look at this game. The second thing that stood out to me about the game is the way it manages its health system. So this game does not go the traditional route of having extends and lives and game overs and things like that. Instead, it kind of takes a Halo model. It reminds me a bit of Halo, where you have a recharging shield and there's no items for it. There's no power-ups or anything like that. Instead, it just recharges over time. I like that idea. But the fun part is that it ties in your attack power with your health. So when you're using your super laser or using your powerful weapons, it drains your health, and that makes a real nice push and pull for survival. Or if you want to attack, and you want to attack big, you need to take a risk for your own safety. And so that has that nice risk reward factor there. And then the scoring system we'll talk a bit at the end, because that's a little bit more complicated. But in the survival aspect, I think this is a brilliant move of giving the player an incentive to play risky and having it pay off in a survival sense. And in some senses, you have to play risky. You can't just sit and hog your shield unless you want to be there all day. So I think this was, again, a very cool decision as far as how the health system works. And there are no extends, so if the health system goes to 0 and you die, you just game over. The next part of the game that stood out to me presentation-wise is the backgrounds and the way the game works with the backgrounds. This is really cool and probably some of the best background work I've ever seen in a shmup. This is very directly going up with the best background work, which I always think is Ikaruga or Radiant Silvergun. where there's so much going on with these awesome 3D backgrounds, the cameras rotating. They went all in on presentation on this game, and I think it really pays off. It really makes the game stand out. Graphically, I love the sort of PS1-esque presentation, but it's just pumped up. It's just razor sharp. The enemies remind me a bit of something from Devil Daggers from time to time, and I'm a big sucker for this style of presentation. I'm like the opposite of Nintendo when it comes to taste with this thing. So Nintendo these days always goes for these soft, childish, round, unthreatening Pixar graphics. I hate that. I like the razor sharp, mean, kind of ugly, threatening style graphics of early 3D stuff. So I really like the way this game looks visually. The effects work. They're going all in on the explosions. They're going all in on the effects. So just picking up the game and playing it, you will not be disappointed with how the game presents itself to you. It's a massive strong point. And it also has some really cool ideas that as I was playing the game, I was like, why haven't shmups done this before? This seems like a really cool idea, which Treasure have a real knack for. And so I think this game in many ways lives up to some of the things that Treasure would typically do. For example, the mech. So there comes a point in the game where you take over, you fly into a mech and you fly around and you have this mech now instead of just your little ship. Again, this addresses the question of making your ship bigger, making your presence on screen more visceral. And also it's really cool because it's like a whole different gameplay style, and it's just a really great idea. You know, mechs have been used in platformers. I remember Mega Man X, you can get into them. It just seems odd that we haven't seen like some more of this type of thing in shmups, at least the shmups that I've played. So I do love this idea of the mech. And so overall, while we're still going into the praise, I'll go with the last point of praise that definitely stood out to me, which is the soundtrack of the game. Now, I've noticed in my reviews, I'm not necessarily as attentive to soundtracks as a lot of other reviews. I kind of forget to mention them from time to time. But this game's soundtrack stood out to me for two reasons. One reason good, one reason bad. The first reason it stood out to me that was good is that it's just amazing. It's awesome. I love this. It's like visceral and well done it is. This is one of the best shmup soundtracks I've heard in a very long time. I just really dig the style. Reminds me a bit of early Guilty Gear, like the Korean version. Love the soundtrack. I hope they put it on Steam or wherever to get it because it's just really great. But it does have a major problem that I think could be patched, and they should patch this, which is the volume of the tracks is not very consistent. So you'll be going and you'll be playing the stage and you're like, yeah, you're pumping along, you're jamming. Then it goes into the boss fight and like the volume of the music explodes in your ears and you hear ringing because it goes so loud. So they need to normalize the volume of the tracks across the game, because that's just a little unprofessional and unpolished. But it seems like something you could patch very easily in like a day. So make sure to do that so you're not deafening your poor audience. But overall, the soundtrack is amazing, and I definitely wanted to comment on that. So let's now talk about a few weaknesses of the game, and then we can end by talking about the scoring system. So the first weakness of the game, I think, is the difficulty. I think the game is a little bit too generous, a little bit too easy, just to be the mode that is presented here. I think if you're a newer shmup player, or if you're not super dedicated to the genre or anything like that, this is actually a great difficulty, a great way to get into the game. And it is fun too. It's not boring. I wasn't like sitting there like, oh, when will this end? It's so boring. It does have a nice difficulty balance overall. The problem is that when you get more into the game, when you start to get like, yeah, this is really cool, I want to keep playing, you kind of end up tapping out a little bit because it's a little bit too on the easy side. So what he needs to do, in my opinion, is he needs to add a hard mode. He just needs to go in, add an extra hard mode, add something like that, because I don't think he needs to change the mode that is available now, because I think it's really great and accessible to a lot of players. But for the players who get more invested and are more veterans of the genre, I do think a hard mode is needed. My second point of criticism that is somewhat related, that Boghog pointed out to me, is that the set pieces of the game are a little bit too brief and breezy. They don't really fully justify themselves, because what will happen is it will spawn this really badass enemy with patterns and you're all excited to fight it, and you'll kill it in like 3 seconds. And then you just move on with your day. So I think those need to be readjusted, even maybe in the original arcade mode, to give them a little bit more health, which is unusual criticism for me because usually I want things to be lower in health. But in this case, I think the bosses and the set pieces, they just need a little bit more action, a little bit more screen time. So I would say bump up their health or something to make that work. So then now let us finish by talking about the scoring system. Now, I'm not fully versed on the, minute details of how the scoring system works. What I want to talk more about is the basic concept of what the game wants you to do. So what the game wants you to do is it wants you to use your powerful weapons that drain your health, and then it wants you to increase what's called the risk gauge or the risk percentage, and you get more score by keeping your risk at basically maxed out. And the way it works is that to get your risk to go, you need to use your laser weapons till 50, then it starts dropping. But what I would suggest is you use it to about 30 to 40%, and then you let it sort of begin to climb back, and then you use them again, and that you keep it kind of under that, and then you'll get your risk gauge up to 100. And then once it's up to 100, you can actually let your health increase to about 50 or 60, somewhere in there, without decreasing your risk gauge. And it gets a little bit awkward because what you need to do is you basically need to just shoot off randomly all this time to make sure your risk gauge doesn't drop and your health doesn't go too high. So I think the idea, the concept of having to have low health to keep your risk high and using that for scoring, it is a good concept. But I think the way it is implemented right now is a little bit awkward because it's just kind of like you're randomly shooting off at times. I mean, even between like in cutscenes and stuff, there'll be like a cutscene you need to fire off while the cutscene is going. I think that sort of stuff needs to be polished up, either for the cutscenes, like lock in everything so you're not gaining health during the cutscenes. And then also another thing is maybe figure out better way to make this happen, like maybe a command or something like Ketsui Destiny, where it enters risk gauge mode and then you just are in risk mode and you just play it that way. You don't have to sit there and watch the meter the entire time and feather your shot, because it feels like half the time you're playing the game and the other half you're like looking at your meter and trying to balance it like it's an old challenge in Dead to Rights or something like that. So that would be my other bit of criticism with the scoring system. Is I love the concept, but I think if they could find a way to enter risk mode and make it feel a little bit more consistent or a little bit more natural, I think that would go a long way. To end this, I wanted to reveal a really cool surprise, which is when you complete the game, you get a 1cc on normal mode, you unlock an extra ship. And man, this extra ship is really cool. What it is, it's a melee sword ship. And many melee sword ships, I'm thinking of Refrain, for example, have tried and haven't really worked too well. The problem with a lot of them is that they're deeply underpowered and not really all that fun to use. This ship, however, the dev was like, no, we're making sure this bad boy is powerful. And so this thing is an absolute beast. Crazy the amount of mechanics it has going on in it. I won't fully explain everything, but it plays completely differently than the main ship. And it's really a lot of fun and probably fits the style of the scoring system a little bit more naturally than the main ship, because rather than having to feather your shot all the time, instead what you can do is you have this command where you cross your swords. I can't remember what the input was, but you cross your swords, powers up your attack, but it also drops your health. So you can kind of sit in that cross sword position a little bit more naturally than trying to balance the risk gauge in the original ship. Overall, though, I definitely recommend the game. I think it is amazing. Presentation wise, music wise, no complaints there other than fix the audio levels. I love the overall features of the game. It has a stage select, boss rush, 6 stages with sort of a final boss at the end there. And then it has the tutorial mode, which is more like a training mode. It's not truly a tutorial mode. It's more like a training mode in Bayonetta, where you go in that area before you fight and you're just kind of in this limbo and you fight random enemies. It's like that more than a full-on tutorial A to B. This is what you do. The prologue is actually a little bit more on the side of a tutorial. It has leaderboards. It would be great if it had replays. What's interesting is that this game is actually made using a program called STG Builder. And for a long time, I've heard about STG Builder, but I've sort of written it off a bit because I'm like, I'm sure it's limited. I'm sure it's probably not that great software to make things happen when you need to get more advanced. This game changed my mind a bit as far as that, because it does seem to be doing a lot of advanced stuff. So maybe STG Builder is a lot better and more robust than I imagined. The real question with that thing, though, people can weigh in on the comments here, is if it could be ported to consoles, though, or is this like, because it's made in STG Builder, is this just forever on PC? That would be interesting to know if STG Builder can output onto a Switch or a PS4 or an Xbox, because I think Indie Shmup should try their best to make it onto these consoles, mostly just for, you know, expanding your player base, because people will literally buy your game on a Switch when they wouldn't buy it on the PC. Same thing with on the PS4. I'm not sure about the Xbox, maybe. So I don't know if that's a drawback of the engine, but I do know that it's done a lot with this, and I do really hope we see some updates with like a hard mode, because this game has a ton of potential, and I do think if you're a fan of Treasure, you're gonna enjoy it. It just really hits on that feel and vibe. So I hope you all enjoyed the review. Please like, subscribe, tell all your friends. We're getting so close to 10K. I'm very excited. I really appreciate you all tuning in. Adios, everyone. Thank you to the $5 patrons: 100, Dingo, Another Joe, Anthony A, Anthony Iodice, Aaron Solis, Ben, Blur STG, Borgie22, Brian Reboot, Brian Shiver, Bubblegum Crisis 1394, Chris Yuzefovich, Chronic Burnout 3, Cook Some Soup, Corey Mark, DES Audio, Danielle Savage, Darren Griffin, Delta Tango 6, Disco Stas Leia, DJ 420, Praise It, Eric H, FCK, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, Hausu, Ilya, Kiwi, JLab, JB RPG, Jim Knockham, Joe Angelo, John Kelly, Game Boy Guru, K, K2, Kikoman 589, Larridge, Malaise, Mark Toms, Megadeth 859, Minung, Mechalin, Mitch LY, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, Neon Dagger Games, Okla Kugels, Philip Mason, Plasmo, Portal 63, Rattlecat, Raul, Rilskeen, Riff Mason, Rolf015, Scanline City, Seesaw FW, 7 Overdose, Shane Sintiansky, SLW, The Boot Rex, The Real Ikuzo, The Dirty Screech, The Old Bensta, TRM, Sugumo, Twilight EX, and Utakaya. Thanks for watching.